Hello, and welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series, brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. Today's roundtable features a distinguished panel from Alabama, the District of Columbia, and Wisconsin, who will discuss their experiences with exchanges between child welfare agencies and education agencies. I am Nick Moser, your host and facilitator for today's discussion. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to discuss a few housekeeping items related to today's webinar. First, if you called in using a phone, please select Leave Computer Audio. You may do so by moving your mouse to the bottom left corner of the Zoom webinar software, and you should see an up arrow that says Leave Computer Audio. If you did not do so already, please do so now. That will help us to ensure a smooth experience when asking questions over the phone. Next, attendees are encouraged to participate in the roundtable with questions or comments. There will be periodic question and answer sessions throughout the webinar, but as of right now, all participant lines are muted, and we'll open them up for Q&A throughout the discussions. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the question and answer feature or using the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. Any additional questions that you have after the webinar, you may submit to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov or to your federal analyst. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me introduce our panelists. First, from Alabama, we have Ramaswamy Masha, IT Manager, Tim Prescott, Fax Project Manager, Donna Reardon, Fax Functional Analyst, Danny Luster, Fax Functional Analyst. From the District of Columbia, we have William Henderson, Interim Assistant Superintendent, Data Assessment and Research, Office of the State Superintendent of Education. We have Megan Doe, Supervisory Wellbeing Education Specialist, Office of Wellbeing, Child and Family Services Agency. In addition, we have Cynthia Stewart, FACES Application Supervisor with the Child and Family Services Agency. And from Wisconsin, we have Jenny Bundridge, Child Welfare Section Chief, Division of Management Services, and John Elliott, Deputy Administrator, Division of Safety and Permanence. So let's discuss the flow of this webinar. We're going to start with a past and present discussion from each of our Title IV agencies, in which they'll describe both the history of their exchanges and where they are today. We'll then talk about governance and technology, security, user impact, which is what effect have we seen both with users and perhaps research, all sorts of things. We'll transition to lessons learned and advice that our panelists would give to folks who are somewhere along this education exchange journey. And then we'll talk about future vision. What we may find throughout the course of it is that future vision may come up just as we're talking about our plans, because we're all working towards something and looking towards the future. All right, let's let the District of Columbia tell us a bit about the history of their exchange.
Sure. Hi, this is Megan Doe. I am with our DC Child Welfare Agency. And I guess, we started where I imagine many states may have started with, which was just completely independently tracking educational data on our youth in foster care. We, without any communication whatsoever with our local education agencies, I'm sad to say, where we really started was in our SACWIS system called faces.net. We did have dedicated education screens that social workers were to use to enter basic information, educational data on their clients, including where the children attended school, what their grade was, whether they had an IEP, very basic level information. But we had no exchange of data happening, again, with our other partnering education agencies. And I would really say there were two precipitating events that prompted us to change that. We had one unfortunate and horrible local tragedy where we had a case that got national attention, the Benita Jacks case, where 4 children were found deceased in their home. It was a horrible case that really got the attention of the mayor to both recognize faulty investigations on the part of our agency and the Child Welfare Agency and not catching things sooner. But I think what really shook people up is these children had not attended school for months, and there had been no reporting by the education agencies to that effect, nor any communication between the 2 agencies that maybe would have picked this up. So I think that was what really got local attention to say we've got to fix this. We've got to do something to get us sharing information. And then, of course, I think the feds also that case happened in 2008, I believe. And then there were some federal mandates that I think other states may mention as a trigger, things like the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act, or the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, which mandated the exchange of information to identify between the agencies to identify kids that would qualify for free or reduced lunch. So that, I think, the combination of those 2 things started to get our agencies talking to one another about how we could structure such an agreement. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, William Henderson, at our state education agency to talk about what we developed.
Yeah, so, and I think I'll add one more thing onto that as well, Megan, is that one of the reasons why we did this as well is because when we wanted to identify students who were eligible for free and reduced lunch. And if you're a foster student, you're automatically eligible because you're awarded of the state. And so one of the things we were doing was we were pushing that data down to the local education agencies so they can quickly identify those students and feed them a lot quicker than just looking through a lot of paperwork. And then, so some of the things that we did was we tried to figure out how do we innovate. How do we make sure that we get this data? Because what FACES had was data, educational data. However, in the district, we have very porous borders. So a lot of the students were moving back and forth daily. So our mobility numbers were very high. So FACES could not keep up with how quickly the students were moving back and forth. So one of the things that we tried to do is provide them more information on where the actual student went when they were removed from the parent home and pushed it back and share that data back with Child and Family Services.
Do you want to
So prompt me. Go ahead, Megan, because
I just say, do you want to describe, so we did eventually come up with an agreement, a formal written agreement that I think we'll talk about a little bit in more detail later. Yeah. But that was first developed in, I believe it was 2013.
Yeah, the ICD, the inter-exchange document where we identified what information we wanted from CFSA, because one of the things we were doing at the time too was identifying at-risk students. So there's 5 categories for at-risk students. Either you're homeless, you're foster, you're overage in high school, or you're receiving TANF and SNAP. So one of the things we did was we met with CFSA on a regular basis to identify what information that we wanted from FACES, and also what information we could share with CFSA. So some of the information that we shared is longitudinal educational data. So if a child was removed from a home, CFSA could go into our statewide longitudinal data system and look at the entire history of that student as far as if they were in public education, what schools they went to, and to get a lot of demographic data on those students as far as assessment information, special ed information, and all other sorts of information that we housed in our longitudinal data system. And so, Megan, if I'm missing anything, please prompt me, because I could talk forever, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only other thing to maybe highlight about how and we'll probably speak to this more in more detail later, but I think the exchange of data, that we were able to orchestrate it so that we have a daily exchange, a daily data exchange, whereby our FACES information about which kids are in care is a daily feed that's feeding directly into the education systems database. So that's happening on a daily basis, and then it is currently only one way. We're not getting the same respective information directly fed back into our child welfare agency, and we can talk a little bit later about why some of the challenges and the reasons that's the case. But the way we structured ours is that the exchange of data that we get out of this is that they are permitting us direct access for select users to access their data, the education database system, so that we can get more of that information that William just referenced. So I think that's a little bit of an overview.
Thank you, Megan. And Megan and William, it sounds like the two of you both covered the past of your exchange and your present as well. Am I correct in making that statement?
Yeah, I don't think we've really made too many changes from the way that we initially established the data exchange. We don't really have a past and present story yet on that, but we can certainly fill you in on some ways that we intend to expand the exchange perhaps in the future.
That sounds great.
But we still have that unilateral, it's not fully bilateral, but we're hoping to get there.
That sounds great. That's completely fine. Taniro, please advance to next slide. And then the slide after that. I think we'll transition now to Alabama.
Thanks, Nick. This is Tim Prescott, and I want to say thank you for letting us participate today. Our story sounds a lot like DC's in that we have a system, we have some dedicated screens for education data. We are dependent on our social workers to enter that. In May of 2013, we were contacted by the Alabama Department of Education at their request to start sending them some demographic information on foster care children. And this was in response to, again, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act of 2010 and the Richard B. Russell Act. So they reached out to us, and they identified the data element. Luckily, this was something that we were able to easily pull from our system and just begin sending them this data. We did a memorandum of understanding that was written and signed by both agencies, and probably within a month or two, we started sending the data to them one way. Fast forward to 2017, we had a site visit with our new analyst, Lori Parton, and her team. And the purpose was for her to come and see our system, get to know us, and begin to talk about the transition from SACWIS and learning to live in a CWIS world. The conversation turned to the education bidirectional interface, and we gave our pat answer that we thought was true. It's just not possible. We're a county-based state. We've got 67 counties, multiple school districts, multiple city school districts, and there's just no centralized database to be able to pull this information. We felt we're sending it one way, we meet the requirement, and it was strongly suggested that we kind of go back to the table on that one and maybe see if we could get our partners from education to sit down and talk and just see if indeed there was something that we could get back. So if you'll advance to the next slide, please. This is where we're at today. We did reach out to our partners, but it took a little time to get them to the table. It was January of 2019 when we did sit down with them, and we had a very constructive meeting, and we found out that they truly did have a centralized database, and it was going to be possible for us to get information coming back on our clients. So that got the ball rolling. We drafted a new MOU, and I'm sure as many of you are aware, even between state agencies, you've got to have a draft. It's got to be reviewed. It's got to be approved by attorneys and then finally signed. So that took several months. But the good news is we're there. We've had some discovery meetings. We've identified. They've actually asked for a few more data elements to be sent to them around birth certificate information. We found out what we can get back as far as demographic and education information on our clients. And we're starting to make modifications to our system to pull that information back. So we're a lot better than we were a few months ago. And I guess we've learned that it really does pay to sit down and talk with your fellow agencies and see what's actually possible.
Thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. Wisconsin, please take it away.
All right, this is John Elliott and Jenny Bundridge. So I can tell we've been on this journey for a very long time, as we were just reflecting. So it really started for us back in late 2012, early 2013, when we received the ACF Education System Collaboration Grant. And so we partnered with our Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, a local county here in Madison, Dane County, and the Madison School District to, one, start building data share agreements at a local level, because we are a state-supervised, county-administered system. So at that time, we wanted to just test this at the local level. And also, I think it's important in context, at that time, DPI, our Department of Public Instruction, was on a journey where they did not have a nightly updated from their school systems. Each school system sent their information in quarterly, so they didn't have timely information. But as part of their overall budget request, they were moving to a system where they were going to have all school districts basically on the same technical platform, where there would be nightly feeds and updated. So I'll get back to that in a minute, why that's important. So within the grant context, we started at the local level to really help, learn what it would take to share the data between the two systems. And also Madison Schools had the platform, the technical platform that DPI wanted to expand to all schools throughout the state of Wisconsin. And so that's why we chose them as our local partner, so that they actually have what they call a portal, a system. People might be familiar with Infinite Campus, which is a system where they can report stuff out to parents and students, but also have a lot of internal reporting capabilities. So they customized and developed the initial portal for workers, so social workers that could log into a separate portal to get key educational information like attendance and grades and that information. So another key piece of that pilot was to really kind of figure out what kind of training we would need, what kind of communication and improvements that we would need, what kind of policies would we need to have in place. And then we also had a research agenda where we really focused on looking at kids in out-of-home care and why they don't graduate and the graduation reasons. So that's been kind of an ongoing piece. So throughout this process, I think that grant really helped kind of set at least the framework for us, because in that process, we really figured out the technical challenges and issues, and Jenny can talk about more of that if people are interested about how we could match the data between our two systems. So we've been able to do that for quite a long time. Also realize what are some of the issues that came up around data sharing, and also what are some of the supports that each system would need. And so as part of that grant, we also, I think a key piece of that, we also in the sense of wanted to make sure that the child welfare system was sharing key information with our school system too. And so as part of that process, we developed what we call an education passport, which I'll have to give New York City credit for that because we kind of stole it from them. But basically that is a worker can fill out, and right now it's optional. We may make it mandatory at some point, but right now it's optional. So when a kid is entering out-of-home care, and especially when they're going to a new school system, the worker can fill out this education passport, which basically captures key information about that child. So whether they have certain trauma triggers that they should be aware of, their likes and interests, so if they're into sports or arts or music, they could pass on key information, key contact information for that child from the foster parents and those type of things. So it's just a way for the child welfare system to share some key information about that child, which didn't violate any HIPAA or FERPA or our kind of internal laws on sharing information, so it was at a very high level. So that was kind of the foundation, really helping us, getting us started. And then along that journey, there was a lot of different things that happened during that process. So one of the big things was, is that DPI, in the sense of they were moving towards a centralized database. Our legislator felt differently about that and said that they can't do that. So DPI had to go back to the drawing board and basically come up with a different technical solution, basically an API type solution where school districts could report in their information and they can transform it. So speed forward now, they've done that in place. So there's, just to put in context, there's about 432 school districts in Wisconsin. So they have done that now. So they do have an updated system where they get nightly feeds from each school district on basic information that they have, attendance, behavioral issues, grades, things like that, graduation rates, things like that. So, so where we've been working today with our Department of Public Instruction, really that grant census foundation. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we've been working on a master data sharing agreement. So what we tried to do, instead of having initially we were on a path where they wanted to have a separate data sharing agreement for every piece of education data that we were going to share. So we've talked them out of that and tried to have more of a master data sharing agreement where we could just update with specific projects that as we move forward. So one of the key things within that is we were moving forward on a project to share disability information for the front end of our system. So we had another separate task force on kids with disability, and we found out that about 29% of our kids that are served in our child welfare system have what we call an IEP, as a data match that we learned from our Department of Public Instruction. And so what we really want to do is develop a data exchange where we'd get some basic information, disability status information, IEP information, primary and secondary disability information that would assist the caseworker with really helping assess child safety, ensure proper planning and services for our standards and our policies for the child welfare worker. And we were on the path to integrate that on a nightly data exchange into our system starting in our February 2020 release. And then it came to a complete halt at the legal level of our Department of Public Instruction. So that's where we're at now on that data exchange. So we have the ability to exchange data. We've partnered with them also on the ESSA report card. So on their website, on their DPI website, they have key information by school district on each kid in out-of-home care that we share information. We've got a strategic plan with them. But the big key is right now is we're really stuck in that data sharing agreement and really identifying the legal reasons for we can share that information. So that's really our only barrier. We've been on this journey for a long time, and we've identified a lot of information. So we may have to move away from the disability data and move back to the kids in out-of-home care. I think that's where we kind of got stuck because those aren't kids that are currently in out-of-home care, which the current federal law really is more particular to those kids and really specifies that only kids in out-of-home care. So that's kind of where we're at, working with our leadership and DPI leadership to really kind of formalize that data sharing agreement.
Thank you. So please advance to the next slide. For our attendees, we're going to talk about governance, and then after that, we will have a short break for some question and answers. I understand that we may have a few in already. So if any occur to you now, as you've heard our panelists talk about their story, please, we encourage you to submit them. Let's dive into these questions. So what data sharing agreements do you have in place? How did you get everyone at the table? Did you have executive sponsors? Let's start with Alabama.
Well, after we had that first initial meeting, they reached out to us, and we had a memorandum of understanding in place with the one directional information that we were sending, but we needed to come up with a new one. So it was drafted by both agencies, and then back and forth between the attorneys. I don't believe there were any executive sponsors or anything, and everybody's shaking their heads here.
That's fine. DC, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think this sounds very familiar. I mean, we, as I mentioned, we first established a formal memorandum of agreement between our two agencies, the Child Welfare Agency and our state education agency in 2013. And I can't speak so much to how we got everyone to the table at that time. I don't know, William, if you have any
Yeah.
insights to share on that. I can speak a little bit about what just happened with renewing that agreement.
Yeah. So the way it happened is that we got the SLDS grant for 2012, and one of the things we wanted to do is just identify, do some data sharing with other different district agencies just to help improve the outcomes of our district students. So we started out with homelessness, and then we worked on foster care. It was really hard to get a data sharing agreement with the homeless organization, which was DHS. So after we figured that out, then it got a lot easier because we knew what conversations to have in advance with the legal to make sure that they were on board before we move forward with executing a data sharing agreement. And then we developed a lot of trust because when we got the blessing from legal to do this, then we had to start really developing trust between the two agencies. And some of the things we agreed on is that we wouldn't redisclose data, and if we do any type of research on the data, we would share it with the entity, and then they would have like buy-in on if we can release that research or not. So it was a lot of just back and forth communications, meetings, and developing the trusted relationships.
Yeah, but I don't know, we did not have any executive sponsors, but one thing we did find important was to make sure we had programmatic people, the folks from the agency that were actually be using the data folks that knew how to, it was really crucial to have them there to know how to orchestrate the exchange, and then our legal folks. So having those three members, I think, from each agency, we found to be very important.
Thank you. That's some good advice going forward. Wisconsin, I understand you're working on a master data sharing agreement right now, but can you please elaborate, or is there anything you'd like to add about how you got everyone to the table, and any about executive sponsors that you may have had?
Sure. So I think we got everybody to the table initially through that grant. That grant really brought us together. That's really kind of, as I mentioned in my opening comments, that was kind of the event that really brought our two agencies together. And so initially the executive sponsors really were myself and the division administrator that heads up their data reporting, analytics, and technology over at the Department of Public Instruction. And so we were initially the executive sponsors, helped through that initial grant, get some of the initial data sharing agreements through. And then through that, then we've kind of transformed it, I think, into the ESSA requirements. And we have a formal team that meets twice a month to talk about kind of our ESSA requirements and how we're working together from an education and DPI. So we have multiple people involved. But we did have our legal department involved. I think the challenge has been, I think there's been some turnover in the legal office at DPI. There's been some new leadership and new people. So as new eyes and fresh eyes from the legal perspective got on that, that's kind of where it came to a halt. So that's kind of where we're at, trying to move forward. We also had our data governance people involved here, their IT and governance people at the Department of Public Instruction. So we had everybody basically except for the lawyers at DPI that have kind of slowed us down.
Well, speaking of being slowed down, that sounds like a perfect transition into a discussion about any legislative regulations that may have limited data sharing, or perhaps on the flip side of that, encourage data sharing. DC, would you like to tell us a little bit about any regulatory hurdles or supports that you had along the way?
Yeah, I think I think one thing that was certainly helpful to us was the momentum that was built around the federal changes and the amendment to FERPA to, for the first time allow the agencies to exchange educational data, without getting the parents' consent. I think that was one of, had that, that amendment coming about around the same time that we were just starting our discussions about, for the first time, establish some data sharing, I think was very helpful to us, because I think whereas previously we were where Wisconsin was and saying, no, this is in no way possible. We can't share that kind of data without parental permission. I think both agencies giving recognition that amendment opened some doors was a big impetus and has proved to be very helpful, I think, in getting both of our agencies to the table.
And I'll add more, a little bit more, Megan. And, so, and one of the things from our perspective is like our mayors, our prior 2-3 mayors were advocates on sharing data with each agency, within each agencies. And one of the things that was even, there was a groundswell of like council members. So when every agency had to go in front of the council to talk about their performance, one of the questions that the council members would ask is, what agencies are you sharing data with? And so that conversation just kept growing and growing. And there's a lot of information out on in our city about how robust our data sharing is because of those seeds that were planted many years ago.
Thank you. Wisconsin, is there anything that you'd like to add?
So what I would add is part of, when the federal legislation was passed, we also codified in state law. And we also thought we made our state law a little bit broader. So again, that we could hit some of the kids in the front end of the system. So when when a family is under investigation. So again, having some of that key education information, especially disability information, may be helpful. But it seems like that's kind of where we hit the issue with our Department of Public Instruction lawyers, where they're citing the federal law around USA Scholars Act really being very particular to kids just in out-of-home care. So not kids that are under investigation. So that's kind of where we hit that hurdle. So our next step is maybe we just abandon that and we move forward to just focus on kids in out-of-home care. But we do have a state law that really mirrors the federal law with a little bit broader restrictions. I mean, a little bit broader than the restrictions at the federal level.
And I just want to jump in really quick. This is Megan from DC. That what you're stating totally resonates with us because we've seen the value that the data exchange for the out-of-home kids is having in enhancing our practice. And we are also looking at ways, is there any workaround not having that FERPA amendment extend to kids that are under investigation? So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Alabama, is there anything that you would like to add to this conversation topic?
Well, I don't think there are really any specific legislative regulations around education. I will say this, when our legislature is in session, it's pretty amazing how much encouragement we get to start going to work to do something when we're called on. We do a lot of queries to pull information when they are discussing making some changes to laws and things like that. And sometimes it will come down the pike toward us. So we're ready and willing whenever we get the call.
Sounds good. So let's transition now. I'm taking a look at the time. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to combine the next two questions into one, if that's okay with all of our panelists. So what we'll do is, do you sit on your partner agency governance or steering committee boards? And we'll start with Wisconsin, please.
So as I mentioned before, under ESSA, so basically we formed our own kind of steering committee related to partnering on education issues. So we periodically get together maybe once a year to do more large strategic planning where I will get involved. But otherwise, that's more at the next level of leadership at the two agencies that get together. And then on individual projects, when as we were down this path on the disability, we'll have a much broader group involved, like Jenny from our technology side and the technology side from our Department of Public Instruction. So we use that mechanism really as to keep in touch and really to plan our focus on even the data exchange issues.
And so using that mechanism to keep in touch, is that also how you go about communicating business or solution changes that may impact either one? Thank you.
Yep.
Alabama, do you have anything you'd like to add related to these two topics?
Yeah, we're not sitting in on any of the committee boards or anything like that. I will say now that we've initiated this contact with education. We're trying to have regularly scheduled meetings, especially it's kind of like project to project communication, discovery meetings. We're having sprint planning meetings to talk about getting user stories into a sprint. So we're trying to have meetings every 2 weeks, and hopefully once everything's implemented, we'll be able to continue having periodic meetings, updates if things need to be changed.
Great, thank you. And DC?
At present, we do not have any formal representation on agency-wide steering committees or that sort of thing. But I will say, I do feel as though our data and programmatic folks that were invested in the development of the agreement are in somewhat regular communication. I think just through establishing the agreement, it opened a lot of doors for relationship building and sort of sharing, either where there's potential for us to grow our agreement in different ways. It's been very beneficial. And then with respect to how we communicate, how those communication lines are open, another thing that we deliberately did in our MOA agreement is clearly establish within the agreement points of contact from each agency so that so you should always know who you can contact if you have any questions about the data exchange as it's delineated in the agreement. And that has, and we also have, which we may speak to a little bit more in a second, but we also have separate points of contact for who to, if there's any breach of data sharing, any data breaches that immediately who to contact so that those can be addressed promptly. So I think that's been effective.
Thank you. With that, I think we're ready to transition to our next slide. Janira, if you would. And now I want to walk you through, we're going to take a quick Q&A, and then I'm going to pass the mic over to Nicole Fuller, who's going to walk us through some questions. So if you wish to ask a question, you may do so there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you navigate it may be hidden, but once you navigate your mouse down towards the bottom of the screen, you'll see it. Left click on it, you may ask a question openly, or you may ask one anonymously. It is your preference. In addition, you may others may choose to use, there's a Zoom webinar chat function and submit a question to panelists in that manner. If you'd like to ask a question over the phone, please select, there's a button on the right-hand side of your screen that says raise hand. If you select that button, then Nicole will walk you through the steps that we can do to bring your question over the line. And with that, I will transition to Nicole. I believe we have one question in the queue already.
Good afternoon. So this question is for all of the panelists. Have you had any issues with the quality of the Department of Education data? In one particular state, there seems to be some issues with the quality of the Department of Education data that can cause issues, so much so that some of the child welfare workers in various counties are a bit reluctant to use the Department of Education data. So how have you handled or addressed data quality issues or concerns between the two systems? And I'll just open it up.
I can start. This is William from Washington, D.C. So one of the things is with Washington, D.C. is I think we have one of the best, the quality of our data is pretty good, because one of the things that we do is that we don't accept data if it's not verified. For example, if a LEA, a local education agency, they submit their data on a nightly basis to us. And say, for example, if the student the night before came across as a Black male, and then the next day it's changed to a white male, we will hold that data back and we will put in, we call it unified data errors, and we will not change that until we get, until they can verify that race or gender has changed. And normally, like if it's a date of birth, we ask for a copy of the birth certificate before we change it. And we don't pass that on to our downstream systems until that data is clean. So whatever data we have prior to that is what we will keep until they can verify the data that they're submitting to us has changed and it is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Would one of the other panelists like to respond?
So I can just say from Wisconsin's perspective, so data quality has not been an issue because when we do exchange data or when we've done it in the past, it's updated nightly. So if there has been any changes in that data, it would be updated and reflected in our system when we get there. I think to me, the bigger issue really for us is the availability of data. So at the statewide level, there's decent level of data available, but a local school district is going to have a lot more robust data, especially if it was around behavioral and attendance issues and like the reason for a suspension or a disciplinary issue. A local school district would have a lot more detail about what that is, where the data exchange at the state level just tells us that that event happened. So again, data quality has not been an issue, but the type of data and the information that comes with it is probably a little bit more problematic for us when we get to that point.
Thank you, John. Tim, anything from your team?
I'm going to let Danny take this one.
Okay. We've already discussed how us and the Education Department are going to kind of match data together. The Board of Education gives each child what they call a SSID number, and that number follows them from the time they enter the public school system to they leave the public school system. We do not get that information. That's some of the information we're going to get from them. Of course, we haven't received any data back from them as of yet. But that's one way we're going to use to match our children. And the other is that we're going to start putting our birth certificate numbers into our system and sending that information also to the Education Department. And we're going to use that as a matching tool to make sure our children are matching up for the information that we're sending them and that we're getting back.
Yeah, and the same thing with Washington, D.C. We have a unique student identifier. So yeah, that same, the school identifier can change, but however, our unique student identifier follows the student if they go from a charter school to a traditional school or vice versa.
So we have an extension to that question, and it has to do with data reconciliation. So at the beginning of a school semester, where a lot of data is entered and or is new, how do you reconcile that data, assuming that there's more reconciliation that has to occur at the beginning of the school year than throughout? And that's open to any panelist.
So from a DC's perspective, so school starts around August, September, and so one of the major projects that we have right after that is our enrollment audit count. So the counting of students. So that's when we really get it right because there's high stakes involved in making sure that each LEA or school gets their proper amount of money to educate those kids. So one of the things we do is we work with them at the beginning of the year to make sure that their data is as clean as possible. We push back to the LEAs all of their errors, like for example, whatever we got the prior day or the prior year, if it's changed from there, we send that back and say, are you sure that this is correct? And if it is, then show us where it did not change or change. And then that's how we will start moving. But we don't change data at the state level. We always make sure that the schools change it and push it through our system on a nightly basis. We just identify what those errors are on a dashboard that we send out to the schools every day.
And I guess if I could add, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Megan.
I was going to add to William's point, I guess, from the child welfare perspective. One of the most valuable things that we found with getting the education data from our education agency is its usefulness in reconciling our data, our child welfare data. So as I mentioned before, right now the only way that we're regularly tracking are, key things that we need to be tracking, where kids are in school, how often they're changing schools, is relying on the social workers to enter that information, directly into our database system, our SACWA system, and there's many times where that's not entirely up to date. By no, social workers struggle with that, and so our data has historically not always been so reliable. So one of the benefits that we have gained from the data exchange and having access to a portal where we can look up enrollment data on any of our youth in care, we do a quarterly data reconciliation process now where we bump up our school enrollment data that we have in our database system, the child welfare database system, against the education system's longitudinal educational database and their enrollment information, and identify the discrepancies. And that has allowed us to clean up more often than not, I will say maybe we're in a fortunate position in that we find the education data, the data coming to us from our education agency is more often than not, it's much more reliable than the data that we're getting directly from our social workers. So we feel that it's done an incredible amount to improve the quality of our enrollment tracking and school changes of our youth in care.
And I agree.
Through that reconciliation.
From DC, and I was, Megan, you're saying exactly, hit the point that I was going to make as well, that from the system perspective, I know that we give an exception report, and we'll probably touch on it in another slide coming up. That's one of the challenges that we have is when we do have that data that does not match up against the school system's records. And so the next step in the future comes trying to figure out what to do with that information that we're receiving that does not match as we expect it to. So I just wanted to point that out from the system perspective as well, that, we notice and we have reports that we have on our end where we give exceptions for things that did not match on that daily run.
Thank you, panelists. We have one more question, Nick, before we'll move on.
Okay.
This next question is posed to Alabama and the Wisconsin team. Can Alabama and Wisconsin comment on the mechanism by which their Department of Ed funded the creation of daily data exchanges with all districts in their states?
So this is John from Wisconsin. So for our Department of Public Instruction, so as I mentioned before, so their original path, and this is probably 8 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, they had an initial budget request that got actually approved through the governor's budget to basically, for all intents and purposes, have everybody on the same kind of like an EWIS-ACWIS system, but a Department of Public Instruction system. And so, but then when they started going to procurement, some legislators didn't like that they were just going to award the contract to one company. And so they put the nix on that, but they still had the money. So instead, they focused their money on creating an API. And so that, again, school districts could choose the product that they wanted to. It had to meet some basic requirements. And so then they worked on basically creating an API that could do the nightly feeds to then feed into their overall kind of DPI system. So they did that. The bigger problem, I think, for us on funding is more when you start talking about data exchange between our two agencies and then syncing up our IT funding schedule and schedule and release schedule with their schedule. So I think at the actual exchange level has been really, to us, has been a lesson learned we could talk about later. But from a funding perspective, it's like their priorities and projects that are for their system don't necessarily always align with our needs.
Thank you, John.
This is Alabama. We didn't have any special funding for this, this one directional that was going over. This was just regular maintenance.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to hand it back to Nick.
Thank you, Nicole. Next slide, please. Let's talk about technology. What technology do you use in your exchange? And let's get started with DC, please.
So the is a FTP. We just send it over there via FTP on a nightly basis.
And hi, this is Cynthia Stewart from DC as well. And I'll also say that, unlike a lot of states, we're a little unique in the sense that we don't run by jurisdictions. By counties, I should say. And so, we actually have an Office of Chief Technology which governs our entire network for all of our entities, all of our agencies. So we're a little lucky in that regard that I'm not sure how the other states are doing it right now, but we don't have firewalls that we have to, go in and out of when we're communicating with our interagencies. And so from that perspective, it's a little smoother. I will say that. And so we are all operating within the same wide area network. Our current exchange, as I think William just said, is, done through a daily batch process. And right now, the way that we are sending the information is through a CSV file, and it's sent daily, as I mentioned, and we give, as people have already said, basic demographic information, social worker information on that file, and just some educational information as well that we have in our system, which again, of course, when it reaches the educational OSCE system, may or may not match. Hopefully it will, but if it doesn't, we just discuss, what happens after that. And that's it for DC from that point.
Thank you. Wisconsin?
This is Jenny Bundridge. We do a web service, which is a nightly batch. So we call their web service, pass our demographic information, and then get the information back.
Thank you. And Alabama?
Hi, this is Ramaswamy Macha. Currently, we are using SFTP. It's a mainframe process, but the new bidirectional exchange we are planning, we want to go for a web service concept with XML. Right now, we are in the design process of that.
Great, thank you. Now, let's talk a bit about your most significant technology challenges with implementing either your current exchanges or the challenges that you anticipate from a technology standpoint in your future plans. And we'll start with Wisconsin this time.
In terms of the challenges for implementing the current, we have such a small use case that we really didn't have any challenges. In terms of future planning, the things that with any data exchange that you need to be aware of are when you're making changes to your system, letting those other agencies and entities know. Likewise, we have to rely on all of those other agencies letting us know when they make changes as well. So I think one of our biggest fears is that when they're changing reference data, that we then cannot account for that. So we just always have to be having those communications to know what's coming to be planned for.
Thank you. Alabama?
And the challenge we're anticipating is more on the type of transactions we want to send with the new bidirectional. We're planning like add transactions when we send first time, then again when there is a modifications, mod transactions using SSID, what they have. Regarding the technology-wise, they are also first time going to web services. Until today, everybody is on mainframe. They are also working with on web services and XML. We are also upgrading our side. So there could be some both sides on web services implementation. But we do have experience in other projects of web services, but with education, it's first time doing web services. So hoping it would go more.
Thank you. And District of Columbia?
And for DC, I would say the technology, I think we kind of touched on it before again with the exchange and the fact that sometimes the data is not matching. And so from our agency's perspective, we're trying to figure out what's that best next step. And once we generate these exception reports and we notice that, Cynthia Stewart was spelled with a D at the end of her name for the file that we sent over to our education agency, but the Cynthia Stewart that they have, last name was, ended in a T, all of us is the same. What's the next step? Do we have our program staff go in there and make the corrections on our end because we know that the education system is probably the holder of that information, and those are the types of conversations I think that we'll start having next and trying to figure out what to do with these exception reports that we find from our end, because more than likely, I think as Megan kind of mentioned in the past slides, that it's probably more likely that it could be an incorrect data entry on our side, and so we want to make sure that we are having valid information in the system. And we do know that for us, duplicate clients are a challenge. And so that exact example with Cynthia Stewart, and I'm sure other states may be facing this issue, how many different ways can you have the same person in your system, and how many IDs do you have associated to that individual, and making sure that, we're talking about the same person when we're exchanging this data. So I think for us, that's the next big challenge that we want to accomplish, is trying to figure out some sort of systematic way to work with program and give these exception files that we're receiving, and what do we do with the next, just to make sure the information is valid and comprehensive on both ends.
Thank you. Let's transition to the next slide, please. Let's talk a bit about security, and for our attendees, we're going to have another Q&A session after this slide. So if you have any technology or security related questions, it's a good time to start thinking about them. Are there regulations or internal policies or procedures that define the security standards for the exchange? And we'll start with Alabama this time.
Yes, we do have security regulations and policies in our division. We follow NIST controls, NIST 800-53, which is a subset of IRS 175. Pretty much we have security group, and all our new processes has to go through the security group, and they have to give a approval before we get into.
Great, thank you. And District of Columbia?
And for DC, from a security perspective, when we wrote the MOA, we looked at it more so from a HIPAA perspective, and just making sure that PHI and PII information is, in that exchange, and making sure that everybody understands that we are guided by that particular policy. And so from that perspective, we just making sure that we are following all of those particular security measures, and from the MOA that we have, we definitely define that out and spelled that out in there.
And from the SODS side of that district is that we do annual audits, and what we do is if we see there's no activity on a actual on a credentials, we deactivate those credentials. We also, before we give anyone access to our data system, they have to sign data security document stating that they understand the importance of this data. And then we also give role based, so you can only see the data that you're required to see.
Thank you. And Wisconsin, anything to add?
So for Wisconsin, we do as well, both from the regulatory and best practices policies, which are outlined in our IT policies kind of for every system. And that applies both to storage and transmitting.
Thank you. And so I'm keeping an eye on the time at this point, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to group the next couple of questions. I heard throughout your responses discussions of some of the permissions groups that you use, but I didn't hear, especially from Alabama and DC, I believe, about the security protocol for at rest and in transit. So Alabama, if you would please take the lead, what security protocol do you have in place for the data at rest and for the data in transit?
Data transit is more encryption. Right now it is the SFTP, fully encrypted. Whereas at rest, since it's a PII, we follow NIST 800 framework.
Thank you.
And regarding the permissions and groups, we do have a security user roles, and only certain users and who have permissions, only they can access data.
Thank you very much.
And this is DC. So from DC's perspective, we also use SFTP for the transit of data. And much like William mentioned before from his school side, we also have group permissions. So we have the system giving information to our faces, but it's only like one data element. The rest of the information, as Megan mentioned, goes into another, it's called SLED, another system that our workers at our agency can access. And so for us, there's only a certain number of individuals who have specific user group access to that data. And so from that perspective, the grouping of it as well is monitored and managed by only giving certain permissions for those who need access to it.
Thank you. With that, let's please transition to the next slide. We're going to take, let's take some time and do a little bit of Q&A. We're going to wait a minute or so, and if we don't get any questions, then we will transition on to the next slides. Okay. I haven't seen any movement in terms of questions submitted at this time, so let's transition on to user impact. What value has each partner found to be the most impactful to child welfare and/or education? And we'll start with Alabama.
Yeah, I think from education's point of view, and they're not here right now, this has been beneficial to them because it's affected the school lunch program and the matching to make sure that we've got the right information going over. It's helped them out getting that demographic information. And I guess if you want to go on to the second one, Danny can kind of talk about from a social worker's point of view how this is helped. We anticipate this helping us.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
As a social worker not doing casework anymore, it would have been very beneficial when this information came in. Some of this information, the social worker is not going to have to enter. It's going to go directly into some demographic information for that child regarding the school system and those type things. So, one, it saves time because we know social workers are extremely busy people. So it would save time, and also it would be able to then compare their data with what the school system is sending to them.
Thank you. And let's go on to DC now.
Yeah, I guess I'll start from the child welfare perspective. I think I've already spoken to the value of the enrollment data that I think has just enabled us to really clean up our data and improve our data quality as we're tracking the school of enrollment for our youth, as well as the all-important school changes and registering the impact that that's going to have on our youth. But the other real values is it's also given us access to the student achievement data for any of our youth. We can immediately go into their portal and look up their most recent standardized tests. We're using the PARCC scores, the PARCC test in DC, so we can see their levels of achievement in both English language and as well as in the math areas to see how they're performing in comparison to their peers. And the special education database access, both the achievement data and special education data, we should have access to on an individual level for each student if the social worker goes up and requests it. But many of our schools, it's amazing how difficult and the barriers that we encounter oftentimes in just getting basic records on our schools directly from the schools. So having where we're encountering those barriers, or when the children first come into care and we know they have a lot of needs and we want to get access to that, as much educational information as we can early on to take into account in case planning, having more direct access to their database system has proved to be a game changer. And just getting more immediate access to vital information.
And then I'll add from DC as well that from a lessons learned perspective and speaking the same language, that as we look to future conversations with our state agency for education, I'm thinking about the fact that sometimes schools define absences different ways, right? And so it could be, and not from a day perspective, but from are you late to class? Does a school, consider a half a day an absence, or does a student have to be absent the full day to be considered an absence? And just making sure that the schooling system is defining it the same way, because a lot of those things end up as reports at our agency. And so if we end up going with another exchange, whether it be an API or a web service, et cetera, in the future, and it'll be very important that we're all speaking that same language on what we're putting and gathering from these systems. And so that will be important. And then as we've touched on before, just making sure that we have people in place and teams that can deal with the discrepancies that we come up with, any duplicate client issues that we may come across, and just verifying the data that is being exchanged back and forth.
Thank you. And Mr. Henderson, is there anything that you'd like to add here?
No, I think everyone hit on all of the impacts that this integrated data has done.
Thank you. Wisconsin, would you please share some of your user impact and respond to both the question about the value each partner has found to be most impactful and about how it's affected outcomes?
Sure. So, I mean, for us, I think, again, because of the situation we're in, I think during the pilot stage, when we were, which is a local county and a local school district, we found a lot of benefits from the worker side in streamlining some of the process. They don't have to get parental consent, so they could get some of that information, which then kind of sped up the conversation that they needed to have with the person at the school. And so we worked really hard to have points of contact so they would know who to contact if they had questions or discussion. So I think from both sides, at least at the local level, they seemed to have particularly, I think it helped with communication and where they wanted to focus their conversation on that child. So I think that was one of the big benefits. I think overall, bigger picture for us, I think some of the benefits we've had in just our research agenda is we're really understanding why kids don't graduate high school, the kids are in out-of-home care. So that is helping us partner with DPI to really figure out what are some legislative solutions or other issues that we can do to help improve our graduation rates, which we're at about 50% like nationwide. So it hasn't necessarily improved any outcomes at this point, but I think the biggest benefit at the local level in that exchange is that communication and streamlining some of that communication.
And can I add one? This is Megan from DC. I did just think of one other outcome in the way that we're using the data that I think has enhanced our practice in efforts to ultimately improve outcomes, and that is by we're able to use some of the data that we're getting from the school system, particularly the achievement data, to better target our resources at those kids that the data shows to be educationally at risk. So, for example, we are fortunate enough at our agency to have contracted tutoring services for those kids that need the academic support. And so now we're able to actually make that a more data-informed process. One of the things that we've started doing is looking at that achievement data and the student level data to identify in the aggregate which kids it's showing that are struggling academically, and then we're being more data driven in targeting those tutoring resources directly to those kids.
And Megan, I'm gonna say it from a state education agency as well, because one of the reasons why we're very excited about sharing this data, or receiving this data from Child and Family Services is the same reason. What our mayor and city council has done is that every student who is in foster care system are identified as at risk, and we allocate a certain amount of money per year that we give to that LEA to support their outcomes, because of course we all know that they're one of the most vulnerable populations in the school system. So we do it on our side as well.
Thank you. With that, let's transition to lessons learned. And as a heads up to all of our attendees, there's another slide following this one, but I'm keeping track of time and I want to ensure that we have sufficient time for questions. So what we're going to do, this will be our final slide in which our panelists will share some of the information, and then we're going to transition to a question and answer session. Let's talk about lessons learned. What lessons did you learn through the implementation of these exchanges? I know each of you touched upon a few throughout the course of this conversation, and we'll start with Wisconsin.
So I think for us, the biggest lesson learned is get the lawyers involved right away on both sides. So I think that's really the key. I mean, I think the spirit of wanting to exchange the data is at the program side on both levels, but the barrier really has been on the legal side. So, and not only legal, I would say at the leadership level. So, I mean, we have an opportunity now because our new leadership actually came from the Department of Public Instruction. So, so that gives us a unique kind of leverage point that we're going to potentially use as we move into the new year to try to overcome some of those legal barriers.
Thank you. Alabama?
Yeah, I think for us, it's pretty basic. Just because it's always been like that doesn't necessarily make it right. Doesn't necessarily mean things haven't changed. And we were operating under misinformation that, we couldn't do a bidirectional data exchange because there was no centralized database with education, and it was just wrong. And it took, having Swami come over to our team and saying, hey, I know somebody over there. Let me reach out to him, and Danny making some contacts to find out, well, yeah, this can be possible, and then just trying to get the right people together to talk about it.
That's very helpful. Thank you. District of Columbia, anything to add?
Yeah, this is Megan Doe. I would start by just saying on the governance end, while we've been fortunate, I think, to have a data exchange agreement that's been working well, one thing that I think we've learned on the governance end is to make sure that we are more frequently checking in about both the status of how things are working, but also the status of the agreement, because we did just encounter a situation this summer where we were not fully on top of the fact that the 5-year duration of our agreement was due to expire, and we had to very hastily, literally I give the benefit, the credit to our education agency colleagues, because they were the ones that reached out to us. We were not on top of this, and they even reached out, I think gave us about 2 months, thinking that would be enough time to update the agreement, and lo and behold, we did not meet that deadline. We should have given ourselves more time because, as some other people have mentioned, once we have all of our Office of General Counsel involved, even the most basic changes, it takes a long time to update these agreements. So I think a lesson learned is making sure that, and I think we still need to work on this, making sure that we have at least some built-in times that we are maybe annually coming together to just, how's everything going, any changes needed, and where are we with the actual agreement itself, making sure that we're more cognizant about that.
And to add to that, Megan, this is Cynthia, I'll just say, even in recent conversations from an MOA perspective, there's the option too of having the modifications to those MOAs instead of having to do them from scratch, you know what I mean? So just keeping that as an option as well, that sometimes if most of it is as it should be and you've added because some practice or program has changed, having the states giving the option of just making an updated version of that by submitting, a modification to it.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to talk about a major challenge or barrier that you faced and how you overcame it. Let's start with Alabama.
Well, I think for us, technically, we're not really facing any challenges or barriers that we can't handle. I think it's the more human aspect of it. It's, the finding out who the right people are, getting them in the room at the right time, and getting that commitment. That's where the challenge is. And it should be easier than it is, especially when you've got two state agencies talking to each other, but it's just difficult. We're working through it, but it's just taken a lot of time. So that, to me, that's the most challenging part that we've run up against.
Thank you. And DC?
I don't think I have anything from the programmatic side. Yeah. I don't know if the technology side, you guys have any insights?
No, I didn't find any challenges or barriers. I think that we're always in constant communication with each other, and we figure out how to solve the problems.
I would agree.
That's great. And Wisconsin, anything to add?
The only thing I would add is, other than the legal stuff I've already mentioned, I think on the technical side, it was really understanding kind of their cadence and sequence of when they make updates to their system doesn't necessarily flow with ours. And so, especially since we are really more of a one-directional data exchange and we want to have conversations about bidirectional in the future, it wasn't necessarily a priority for them to kind of meet our kind of IT schedule, our release schedule for our SACWIS system. So to me, that's a big lesson learned, and make sure that we get that up front when we're talking about that exchange and the timing and the resources on their side needed and the resources that we need to do it so that we can sync up their development cycle with our development cycle.
Thank you. And with that, we've reached, this is our final question and answer session. So if you've had a burning question and you haven't really known when to ask it, now's the time to do so. As a reminder, you may do so via the question and answer session function, via the chat box, or by raising your hand. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Nicole as we sit here and wait. I don't think we have any questions at this time.
We don't, Nick, so I'm going to move it right along. I'm going to say going once, going twice. I don't think we have any questions. Oh, there's one. Hold on. So there's a question that says, can states share their MOA or your agreements? So I think our answer to that is yes, but our ask here from the central office would be you do need to reach out to each state individually. And so we will, when we send out the deck from today, the PowerPoint from today, you will have the contact names of who to contact from a state or the District of Columbia's perspective. So please feel free to reach out to any of those folks who can then release their specific legal or MOU agreements.
Nicole?
Yes.
We do have the CSWAP functionality that if states are interested, they can upload their memos of understanding to our CSWAP component, and then states could access all of them that are available.
Yes, that was Mr. Terry Watt, who's been here in the room all afternoon. So yes, CSWAP is available for any states or territories and the District of Columbia to upload information for sharing. And if you need any help in doing so, I think that there is a link on the CSWAP page, and I'll even ask Nick when we send out the PowerPoint deck that we'll also send the link out to CSWAP in case there is anyone who would like to share that information. Thank you, Terry.
If we don't have any other questions, I personally want to thank the states for their time and effort. I want to encourage everyone, we're going to run into roadblocks. We're going to run into bumps in the road. If you can't get 100% today and can get 75%, by all means, go for what you can get. Start this process. Continue to break barriers perceived barriers that might be preventing you from sharing data. And I still can't get my head wrapped around, and I've heard the same argument that Wisconsin brought up, where an education office says, you know, we really can't share information about foster care disabilities. And I just don't understand what they know that we don't already know. And if the child was with their parents, the same thing applies. So continue to push that envelope. In the short term, if you have to take something less, by all means, start it. The benefits will flow, and people will start to become more comfortable with the whole process.
Terry, if I may ask a follow-up question about that. When you said, you know, if you can get 75% or if you can get part of the way, what are some ways that states could do that? I guess I'm specifically thinking, especially for county administrative states in which they may face unique or different challenges than perhaps our state managed.
If the state is able to create an exchange with a couple of large counties because of the technology that exists there, but can't do it with all of the counties or all of the jurisdictions in the state, start there. Demonstrate the successes that you can, and you might be able to get the funding to fund those smaller counties or the smaller jurisdictions in order to support this kind of exchange. And remember, this is to the extent practicable, and if you can only do it in one large county as a starter, that's perfectly fine.
Thank you. It doesn't look like we have any more questions in the queue. So with that, we'll do a quick wrap up. I want to thank all of our panelists for their participation today. That was very informative. And if you'd like to contact them directly regarding a specific question, the points of contact are listed on the slide here. For Alabama, it's Danny Luster, danny.luster@dhr.alabama.gov. Spencer Wilder, spencer.wilder@dc.gov. And John Elliott, john.elliott@wisconsin.gov.
Email address for Danny Luster, danny.luster@dhr.alabama.gov. Email for Spencer Wilder, spencer.wilder@dc.gov. Email for John Elliott, john.elliott@wisconsin.gov.
I read through those responses for a Section 508 compliance purpose, so thank you for your patience with that. Up next with the Children's Bureau webinars, we are planning a Platform as a Service, a federal perspective webinar. More details about that will come as we get that. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation today. And that ends the roundtable discussion.